You like I said that's me yesterday.
I know. I didn't respond anymore. I didn't know. I'm like, yes, I am. Is it on?
Not yet.
Yes, it's on. It's on. It's on.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Hey.
Tim tay chỉ chào.
Call me. You hear what I said?
It's the side.
Wait, the camera's on. All that little.
That's why you always follow your runner.
Let's go. Okay. That's what the guy from last night said. Let's go this way.
That's what you said to the guy from last night. It's all recorded, guys.
Okay, Nima, who's going first?
Hold on.
Yep.
You need the timer?
He's timing, but if more people time, that would be great. Welcome to round 4 this year's national. My name is Marina. I'll be your chair. Handling with me are Suhaila and Esther. Alright, cool. And we'll follow up having students.
Yeah. The irony of getting an Iranian to defend the prisoners, running for parliament, ladies and gentlemen, to have power to the people who have committed crime. And it was not a coincidence, and it was actually a reason, because I'm going to prove to you why they have the right and they should go there and they should be there. The case is very simple. If you have been convicted from any crime, that shouldn't hamper the right of you, neither the right of the people to grant you the mandate to represent them, specifically in the parliament, right? This way is not going to be about the government or running for presidency, right? And we don't think that's a debate. And like, it might be a progressive change that would happen, and we don't think that's going to be a problem. But we're going to have a specific limitations on you as an individual if you're a convicted criminal and you are running for presidency. In case you win, we don't think it's fair and it's going to serve the justice system objectives that we have if you just let you go or provide immunity for you. Even if the immunity is provided for the parliament members, we think that's something that we'll be more than happy to remove that for this particular individual. Sit down, right? I just start. So we are going to be providing escorts for you. We will facilitate your communication, and we would ensure that in a restricted manner you have access to deliver your duties to the people that you are representing eventually at the end of the day, because we think people have those rights, and we are assigned that people have assigned a specific duty on you, and that duty will come with the sort of privileges that you would get, but that doesn't mean absolute freedom that would get, and you will still be serving your sentence. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the nature of parliament and politics, how we would end up with better politics, or we would end up with a better parliament. Secondly, I'll be talking to you about the mandate of people. And thirdly, I'll be talking to you about the criminal justice system. But before that, any PR?
If an individual was convicted of a crime as a representative at any level, would you still allow him to run for parliament?
Yes, we will still allow. The motion says convicted of any crime. So if you come up with any question, we're going to say yes, right? We're not going to scroll the motion, right? See, the point is that whatever you have done in the past, that doesn't determine what you're going to do in the future, right? You have to come here and prove to you, just because you have been, for example, you have been gay when you were 16, you're still gay when you're 20, right? Or you have killed someone when you were 16, you're definitely going to kill someone when you're 22, right? We cannot predetermine and we cannot prejudge people's action in the future once they haven't done that, right? But we have to grant that opportunity to the people to choose who they want to be represent them. I think that's right, and that's fine with them to do so, right? But let's look at the nature of parliament and how the election works, and we think there are sufficient check and balances there, right? See, when it comes to a parliament, it's about representation. we cannot just absolutely preclude a particular spectrum of people who can be a possible spectrum to represent people within the parliament, right? See, there is no absolute ban and there is no blanket policy to particular individual. It should come at the, it should be only hinges on the people's the mandate and only hinges on that. Why? Because we think there are sufficient check and balances to ensure the continuity and a clear governance of people who are there. What are these check and balances that exist, right? For example, firstly, the moment that you are chosen to be in parliament, the judiciary watch is always there. Your life is going to be scrutinized, not just by other stakeholders that exist there, but also with media, also with the people who have voted you in, because now you're accountable to them and you have to answer to them. So if you fuck up again, right, the possibility of you, that mandate being removed and you being put it back in jail is there anymore. But if people choose to trust you and they trust you that you are not gonna do sodomy again, right? For example, that like, you know, then people should have the right to choose you in. But furthermore, even if people are so moderate and mild, there's always be a vicious opposition to scrutinize your life and to ensure that you are accountable to the actions that you're going to do. The sort of accountability that exists within check and balances that are there, doing something that would ensure that we are going to have a good parliament member, or even if you do bad, people make mistakes all the time, right? You don't have to ensure that you make the right choices. You only have to ensure that you have a platform to make a choice that you want to make eventually at the end of the day as a people, ladies and gentlemen. But even if you are so bad of a criminal and you run for parliament, people are not stupid to vote for you, ladies and gentlemen. So sort of natural check and balances exist there. Okay, but let's look at how it would change the dynamics of the politics. The politics and the discourse, the political discourse that exists now is a lot of the discourse and discussion that happens is based on the character and the wrongdoings and the past doings of an individual. Just because in the past you have made mistakes, now people use that as a tool to sabotage your image, and they use that as a tool to sabotage it. But after we do this, now we are shifting the focus from your past doing. It doesn't matter what you have done in the past. We are not going to judge you based on that. We're going to judge you based on who you are at this very particular moment. And we are going to only discuss objectively the value of the policies and the value of the promises and your ability to deliver those promises. So the discourse is not going to be about who you are or who you have slept with or who you have paid for sex to, ladies and gentlemen, but the political discourse would solely focus objectively about how useful you are going to be to the society and how useful you are going to be to the people. And even if the worst case scenario in a corrupted environment, that political parties always use the sort of image and they use a lot of the stuff to sabotage your image, now we are removing that too. Now we are removing and closing down the room to abuse, to go out there and put up negative advertisement about the particular individual past or about the particular individual character. If you do something bad, now even if the government would intentionally manipulate the laws to put you in prison, they cannot do that anymore because the political leverage that you have there is going to be there and it's going to remain there eventually at the end of the day. Well, let's look at the mandate of people, right? You know why we shouldn't do it, right? We think it's very simple. The right of your representation, right, to be represented is not only your right, it's the right of the people as well. So the moment that we do not let people to choose you, we are not just violating your right, but now we are violating the right of the people. That's something unjust, and that's something we should change, right? See, the case that we have ensures the rehabilitation of a particular individual, because we are not going to grant them the sort of limitations, we are not grant them the full immunity or the release to the public. Still, their right to mobility is significantly limited, right? So they are going to be rehabilitated. But we think the sort of, and that rehabilitation is going to be facilitated by a sense of duty that we have imposed on this individual, right? But see, the benefits that we have are very significant, right? Because of the duty that we are significantly granting to this individual, some privileges come automatically by that, right? And that's the sort of thing that you get because people have voted you in and you deserve it. For all those reasons, we are very proud of it.
Thank you very much. Now let's invite the Leader of Opposition to give their presentation.
we understand that the intention of opening government is very noble. That we don't prejudge individuals, that we give them a second chance. But we think that in this particular scenario, the ability for you to run in office is not an inherent right that is granted to every individual. More than that, we think it's a privilege that can be removed once you breach the law, Madam Chair. What is this debate about from side opening opposition? We think that the ability for you to run as a member of House of Parliament is a privilege that we don't accord to every single individual in the society, and we can limit that to individuals that have committed a harm. But before I move on to my substantive, let's look at a few things that came from the Prime Minister. Because he told you essentially that we cannot prejudge individuals for past mistakes. But if you look at their model, there's a tension there, right? Because it works in a restricted manner. Because they told you that they can't be granted full immunity because we have to err on the side of caution. They tell them that we want to facilitate rehab. But that's a prejudgment that these are individuals that are more likely than not that will commit the same kind of harms, that this is a prejudgment that a rehabilitation that you're fighting for under your side of the house did not work. No, thank you, sir. But secondly, on representation, we don't think that just because you form a particular group of individuals that you are the best person to represent that individual. We think that democracy has moved forward in terms of other individuals from other groups being able to represent other groups' interests. For example, we have men representing female interests within the parliament. We have white individuals representing African American interests. We don't think that it's limited. But thirdly, let's look at the check and balance that Vera wanted to talk about. Because we think that under that side of the house that you concede a potential harm. But we also think that the kind of check and balance that you employ is a reactionary measure that only acts insofar as when that person has committed the pernicious harm. And we'll tell you within my substantive why we have to err on the side of caution, because we protect a larger interest within society. Lastly, they told you that individuals are not stupid. We think that some individuals within society that run for politics have a massive political clout in terms of the influence that they have. No, thank you. Especially when you come from things like political dynasties like Thaksin Shinawatra, Madam Chair, or he still has a large number of followers within Thailand. And we think that this is something that we want to avoid. We think that this political party leverage argumentation does not make sense, because we think it's more likely than not that the ideologies of that political party become subsumed to the kind of destructive attention that is afforded to these particular politicians. Let's move on to opening opposition. What is the stance coming from our side? No, thank you. We think that representing yourself and representing individuals in the House of Parliament, A, is a separate from being able to participate in a democracy, but B, is a privilege and not a right. What do we want to prove in this debate? No, thank you. That we think that number one, representing individuals in the House of Parliament is a privilege and not the right. And here's the distinction, right? Because we think that participation in a democracy is an innate right, and we don't remove that. What do we mean by this? We allow for capable adults, irrespective of past convictions, to still be able to vote. Why? Because states don't go gung-ho on condemning all individuals that have committed a crime to civic death. That's why we have things like work in prison programs. That's why we have work placement assistance when you leave. That's why we have things like paroles. No, but we always limit the potential harm that may accrue based on your past action. Because the state understands that though not everyone in society is bad, that though and not all ex-convicts will commit bad, we think that we always err on the side of caution. That means A, we never place them in an environment where there's a tendency for harm to necessarily accrue, or where there's a tendency for abuse to happen. For example, individuals that are convicted of sex crime, we don't place them in schools or in areas where they are closer to potential victims, Madam Chair, because we understand that we need to provide an environment where there's not a tendency for them to be able to commit those abuse, right? But B, we also allow for constant monitoring for these individuals, because we understand that the likelihood still exists irrespective of the kind of rehabilitation. No, thank you. But why do we think the Parliament isn't an avenue that we can allow? And this is why my point of information was very important. It was dismissed by Berak, right? Because he never was able to answer if a person that was no, thank you. If a person that was prior, like a member of a constituency of a particular state, was convicted of fraud in that particular scenario, can he still run for office? He said yes. And this is the problem, right? When you place them in an environment of politics, especially in the House of Parliament, we think that there are 4 considerations that you need to consider. A, the fact that there's a large power that you hold over society in terms of the decisions that you make. B, the fact that there's a large number of influence that you can have because you are the person that is leading that community. 3, we also think that the kind of discretionary powers that you can have in terms of decision making and supporting particular policies over another. But lastly, the access to economic capital in terms of the kind of funding that you have within a particular scenario, right?
Yeah.
We think that individuals within the House of Parliament especially make decisions for a lot of individuals within society. And the kind of check and balance that exists only occurs insofar as a reactionary measure, and we don't think that that's enough. We think that in that particular environment, the kind of abuse that may necessarily happen, we should err on the side of caution and stop that before it even happens, Madam Chair. We don't want to take that chance because the kind of check and balance, things like removing them from office, occurs sporadically, right? It happens like once every 4 to 5 years. Everything that this is hard. Before I move on to what is a qualifier to democracy and why this doesn't fall in there, I'll take Vera.
You characterize people as those who are so naive and so easy to be manipulated. If you are so naive and it's so easy to manipulate them, why do we give them a right to vote?
No, thank you. Sorry, no. Madam Chair, we're not absolute on side of opposition, right? We tell you that there's a spectrum of individuals in society. We recognize some people are rational, some people are not. But at the very least, we are on the side of caution and limit the ability for those irrational groups to be able to pull the kind of political clout and influence that those individuals have. We think that's fair. We think that these individuals can still vote for other individuals in society that did not break the law. But what is a qualifier to democracy? We think that you still have represented interest because we think that individuals we let individuals be backed by different kind of tickets in terms of how they want to represent themselves. This debate is not about purity and elitism, but it's about the standards that we accord to politics. But we think it also creates an unhealthy political environment. We want a constructive democracy where the fighting isn't focused on the characters of the individual. We think it creates an unhealthy political landscape. How so? The kind of political ammunition that you have is distinctive than any other characterization. For example, things like your homosexuality or things like your race and your religion, because more often than not, society can react as a counter-narrative and say, those are things that are not nice to say to this politician. But in terms of committing a crime, we think that the larger rhetoric that exists within society is that we don't want him to be elected as a representative because we don't trust him because he has committed a breach against the very laws that he's trying to create within the parliament to begin with, Madam Chair. That's a distinction to the kind of attacks that can exist in this particular scenario. We think that that is when you create political apathy because the society, or the larger majority, does not have trust in the kind of governance that exists within the parliament. If you believe that these are individuals that are more likely than not will commit some form of harm, that you have to err on the side of caution, you must oppose this motion.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the Defense Minister.
Yeah.
We tell you the reason why participation in Parliament or representing the people in Parliament is not a privilege but a right is because it facilitates the very nature of democracy in the first place. Second, the reason why it is also a right and not a privilege is because if you look at most reasonable Western liberal democracies, nearly anybody can run for parliament with, in this case, the exemption of, say, criminals, convicts, etc., etc., etc. But even if that's not the case, we think that should be changed because we don't see why you should only be able to vote and not actually participate in political discourse. One of the primary reasons for political apathy in a lot of countries is that they're unable to relate to the candidate that is being proposed. And the only alternative then is to run themselves. In other words, we recognize that the best way to achieve representative political discourse is through participating in Parliament, and the best way to do so is by running in the first place. Hence, it is a right and not a privilege because it is what allows for democracy to exist or occur in the first place. A couple of issues I have with side opening opposition. First, they've assumed we're talking about only ex-convicts, and that's why they said, well, the issue of prejudgment occurs. We think if they're ex-convicts, we're perfectly fine with them not having the sort of checks and balances that not really checks and balances, but the sort of security measures against them. Why? Because we think that the criminal justice system already recognizes that these individuals have successfully rehabilitated, and that's why they were released. Unless they're willing to come up here and undermine the overall value of the criminal justice system and say that it is absolutely unable to rehabilitate individuals, They are assuming a blanket policy, sit down. When it comes to individuals who are currently convicted and who are currently in prison, it is not prejudging them. We are just allowing for the course of law to exist or occur through incarceration, limitation of access and ability, because that is the sentence you receive. But that doesn't mean that you should not be allowed to run for parliament. Why? The primary reason why we imprison you is, sit down, is to disable you from essentially pursuing certain laws. The primary right that we're taking away from you is only the right to mobility, because that right to mobility is what has allowed you to fulfill and commit a certain crime. However, the right to political representation or the right to participation in parliament is not a right that you utilize to abuse anybody or to violate anybody else's right, and therefore that right isn't taken away from you. But why then is it okay for individuals from political dynasties or individuals who have been convicted of crimes of fraud in parliament to continue to run? A couple of things. First, I think they undermine the value of the sort of checks and balances that Behra talked to you about. We're not talking about being removed from office. We're talking about never ever getting into office in the first place. If your commission of fraud was so significant and so real and so problematic, and society believes that you're unable to rehabilitate, then you'll never ever be placed in parliament. But more importantly, if you've committed this crime and you are placed in parliament, that is the crux upon which democracy operates. And the only way they can justify not allowing these individuals to sit down is if they argue to you on an absolute basis that the majority of society is irrational, which gets me nicely to the crux of side-opening opposition's case. The crux of side-opening opposition's case is the failure of opening government's case on the primary basis that these individuals will inevitably get into parliament, and they say because they're irrational people in society. The only way that flies in this debate is if a majority of society is irrational and unable to evaluate the credibility of this individual. One primary argument that Behra brought up here that they absolutely ignored is the idea that political discourse today is focused on your character and it is focused on things like whether you committed a sex scandal or not. We think that's problematic. We now shift the discourse to force individuals to engage on a more real level, because when now all convicts are allowed to run, you can't be running around getting every convict to say he committed this crime, he committed this crime, and he committed this crime. You just look like a petty individual. For you to actually be able to engage in politics, you are then now forced to evaluate the objective value of the policies that these individuals bring forward within the run-up to parliament. In other words, we're cleaning up the political discourse, or even the running up to parliament, from being just about naming and shaming individuals, because it won't work anymore. The government has already endorsed these individuals as capable of running, even if they have been convicted. You force these individuals now to move on to evaluating objective policy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my speech. But before that, yes.
That's not mutually exclusive. You can still have some people inside there outside of the house, but if it's such a right, then why do you still make individuals run for an election?
Yeah. Because you can only represent people if they want you to represent them. It is a right for you to be able to access it. The same way you have a right to access education, but we don't drag you and drop you in school because you must have the ability to exercise that right. The existence of a right doesn't mean we force you to be in parliament, because then it is absolutely impractical. For you to say that we are running for having 30 million people in parliament is absolutely ridiculous. The right to be able to participate means your right to be able to participate shouldn't be hindered by the state. But when the people do not give you the mandate, we think that is also how democracy works. You do vote, etc., but your ability to influence policy is in itself something that the people should be able to decide. Sit down. They absolutely forgot to engage with this idea of expanding the sort of political discourse or the realm of political discussion. In other words, we're becoming a lot more inclusive in how parliament runs. We don't think that this debate is about whether this policy is absolutely necessary, but rather about whether this policy will better facilitate the primary purpose of parliament. With that, I believe that the sort of problems that they have with access to power, discretionary power, etc., are removed, because if people want you to have this access, if people want Thaksin back in the government, we don't think that is a problem. We're not here to place value judgments on individuals who enter parliament, because at the end of the day, that should only be contingent upon the will of the people to allow these people to enter into parliament, even if they are horrible individuals. But if the people ruled they should be in parliament, that is how democracy works. And that's why a lot of the world's Western liberal democracies get presidents like George Bush, even though he was a stupid idiot, but he still got into government, because that is an inherent right of individuals and the people to be able able to choose. So it's a two-way street that Mehra talked to you about. It is not just about having the right to be in parliament, but giving the people the right to be able to choose from as many candidates as possible. Considering to be able to run from parliament, you will need a certain minimum endorsement before you get to the latter stage of elections. But one important thing or a couple of things sort of to conclude my speech. What we are primarily looking for is two things. The first aspect, which is what Behra talked to you about, is primarily the inclusiveness of these individuals into the system. It is crucial to allow for these individuals to be part of the system because that enhances the quality of the system in more ways than one. First, it cleans up the political discourse. Second, it gives individuals a greater amount of choice in terms of deciding who's in parliament, and that is inherent right, even if they want to argue being in parliament is an inherent right. But more importantly, we think that this will have a general positive impact on the ability of prisoners to reintegrate into society. Why? Because ultimately the reason why prisoners can't reintegrate is because we always place the stigma of incapacity or incapability upon these individuals. When we then allow for convicts to run for parliament, we're saying that even if you've committed a crime, that does not determine your future ability of being an individual. It primarily means that individuals are capable of rehabilitation. We are re-endorsing this concept that individuals can fully reintegrate and be functional citizens of society. What they are doing is essentially just discriminating against individuals and creating a dysfunctional democracy. Unless they're willing to argue an absolute irrationality of the people, we don't see why our policy shouldn't get through.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to give a speech.
Madam Chair, we always set a standard on people who can access power. Because when you can access power, there's a wide discretion that you have. Because of your power to affect society, because of your position to influence society. So that's a power that we grant to you, and that's a power that we need to limit. So under that, I'll be asking a few questions. One, are we really incapable of making some kind of limitation on the amount of people that can access power? Are we prejudging that? Secondly, are society a natural check and balance, and is that sufficient? Thirdly, is that check and balance of voting them out a sufficient check and balance? Lastly, what are the three things that Jay said that they never responded to? Firstly, let's deal with this, right? Because they told us what we did is we put a stigma on ex-convicts or on convicts on how they can react or their capability. Firstly, we told you that we understand that this is a blanket policy and that some people are able to go beyond that. But that doesn't mean we don't err on the side of caution. The reason why we do is because this is a huge amount of power that we give to them. So we need to balance that amount of power and that consequence of giving them that amount of power and the risk to giving them that amount of power to the benefits that we can accrue. So they never told us the amount of benefits we can get. So it's very hard for us to balance that. No, thank you. Sit down. It's not a stigma, but it's naive if we don't want to limit the ability of certain people to access power, because they never responded to the example, no thank you, that Jay gave to you. Jay told you that we already limit the ability of sex offenders to be teachers or to access school grounds. The reason is because we want to limit the amount of risk accessible to them. No thank you. And we also recognize that in a position of power, if sex offenders are teachers, then they have a larger amount of power over their students. And that gives them more ability and more discretion to either abuse their students or things like that. We think this is similar. If you give them the amount of power, they can offend. No thank you. So we need to err on the side of caution. Now, secondly, their case primarily rely on the fact that society is a natural check and balance because most of society is rational. No, thank you. Are all society rational? Firstly, we don't think so. But even if they are, you are wrong if you don't understand that being in a position of power have the ability to affect a large amount of people. Like, for example, the MP in Seremban was highly corrupted. What he did was that he ran for MP in Perak after he screwed up Seremban. So what we realize is that not in all democracies are they able to scrutinize capability to the fullest extent. They need to argue, they need to tell us that all democracies are capable of full access to information and all democracies are void of bad voting or bad access to good access to information and things like that. Since that is not present and that is status quo, they cannot argue in that absolute context anyway. So we think that it's more likely that these people are able to re-access power given their previous position of power also. No, thank you. No, thank you. Furthermore, they wanted to talk about check and balance, like you're able to vote them out and their accountability to the people. We realize that in most democracies, not all accountability is absolute anyway. That's why we put all kind of check and balance, and this is another check and balance that we put. Firstly, you can only vote them out every term, and they have a wide amount of discretion and a wide amount of control over all the transparency laws that you want to subject them to. If they're in power and are able to control policies that scrutinize them, we think that they're in the power to do all those things. No, thank you. So we think that given the wide amount of influence and discretion, you're also assuming that every democracy has a strong opposition and an opposition that are able to access the amount of scrutiny that you want to give to them. Not all oppositions are that way, especially in Singapore. No, thank you. And we also tell you that it was so hard to remove President Bush despite the amount of atrocity that he did. This is evident to show you that society's ability to scrutinize the government doesn't mean that they have absolute accountability over this person. Anyway, no, thank you.
Jasmine.
So what did Jay tell you? What did Jay tell you that they didn't respond to? Firstly, Jay already told you that the right to participate and the right to represent are two different rights. This is because the right to participate is integral to you because your interest needs to be protected. But your ability to protect another person's interest or your ability to have society's interest landed upon your hand is a privilege because you are able to represent them and are able to make decisions for them given the amount of discretion that you have. Well, sit down. So the rights of prisoners that we miss, prisoners are able to also express their opinions and make sure that their rights are protected because their votes are counted as well. Go ahead, Behar.
Okay, see, you are arguing that the government's duty is to ensure everybody make the right choice. Firstly, what's right and why government should define it. Secondly, then why do we let people make choices like smoking cigarettes or choosing George W. Bush as a president?
Thank you. We limit the amount of we protect society every time we see there's a high likelihood of harm. And we already told you why there's a high likelihood of harm given the amount of influence that they have, their ability to affect policies and the wide amount of discretion they have. Furthermore, we also told you that we respect the criminal justice system, but we need to understand and we do not need to be naive that it is imperfect. In general, if there is a rate of people to re-offend, that means there's an ability and a risk that a person you're putting in parliament is also someone who's able to re-offend, someone who used to be a rapist, someone who used to commit fraud, someone who used to commit atrocities. So all these things are ability of them to do the same thing over again. So if they have made that choice once, we say there's a capability of them to make the choice later on. But this is another thing that Jay said that was completely dismissed. Jay told you that it was created an unhealthy political environment. Their only response to it was very minimal. They say that, well, under our side, you force them to evaluate capability rather than evaluate character. Well, they must prove to us how their policy creates that rather than hope that their policy will create some kind of distraction from a person's character. We see that that's what they hope, not what would happen. Because we see in society, even if you want a policy to force them to evaluate, it will not happen. What usually happens is like what happened in Thailand. There exists a tension in society where some people are influenced by the extreme rhetorics that those individuals in power have, while others are sick and tired of his crimes and what that he did. So this creates a huge tension in society, and that's why Thailand politics are unable to reconcile because some people are still attached to the idea that criminals can re-offend, while some people are influenced by the rhetorics. So what we tell you is that a member of parliament has a wide amount of ability to affect all of us, and we need to limit the amount of people, the person who can access that power. The moment you commit a crime, you have lost that privilege.
very much. We change the case to closing half, I'd like to invite member of government.
Madam Chair, the position coming from closing government will be simple. We think in times where there's complicity with the judiciary and the executive, we think this particular policy creates a powerful opposition to the tyranny of unjust laws. Madam Chair, we think we're proud to defend that from closing government. What will I talk to you about? What will I talk to you about in my speech? Firstly, I'll tell you why is this important tool to combat unjust laws. Secondly, I'll tell you why this is ultimately good for Parliament, the diversification of the people that are elected into Parliament. And thirdly, why this is an important element in restorative justice and sparking the discussion into why communities and government policies are equally complicit in the creation of criminals in society, and why that's particularly important, right? Before that, I'll talk about 5 levels of rebuttals, right? Firstly, with regards to privilege, right? With regards to this whole argument about privilege, our response is simple. The gatekeepers with regards to who gets the privilege and who doesn't is ultimately down to the people, Madam Chair. Everything let the people decide who ultimately should deserve the privilege, and whether or not the right should be accorded should be ultimately left to the people, right? Secondly, with regards to the huge amount of influence people have, we think number one, with regards to that, we think it's important to allow people to decide and rationalize and make trade-offs. If people recognize that this individual was involved in corruption or was involved in embezzlement, but they prioritize the value of representation, they prioritize the unique values that this politician stands for over the fact that he may have committed some crimes in the past, why not allow people to rationalize this and make the trade-off for themselves if that's what they want, right? We think the decision to vote, Madam Chair, it's a complex one and involves multiple variables, right? We think individuals on the ground can rationalize that, let them make the decision, right? But secondly, Madam Chair, people already know that this individual has done bad things in the past, which means the voting is an informed process. They know that this individual has done bad things, but they're choosing to make that trade-off. This is important. We need to recognize that trade-off, especially because people already know that he's done bad things, but they prioritize something else. They prioritize other values this politician stands for. Thirdly, with regards to bad politicians coming back and being re-elected, right? We think it's important to allow people. It's important to allow the people's will to manifest. Because the only way we delegitimize bad politicians is to allow them the platform and allow them to show that they are a bad choice to make. Once you delegitimize them, Madam Chair, I think that is when people move away from the Dakshin Sinawat trust, Madam Chair, and vote for more progressive politicians. As long as they are in exile, or as long as they're not allowed the political platform, they'll always be martyrs. They'll always be icons for individuals at rallying point, Madam Speaker. We need to delegitimize them, and permanent political platform is the best way to do this. Fourthly, with regards to the rationale of individuals and maturing democracies, we think part of maturing democracies is also about electing bad leaders, Madam Chair. It's about making bad decisions, and that is part of the process, Madam Chair. Why is it important? Because it's only when we allow the platform, it's only when we make mistakes like George W. Bush, you create discourse, you create delegitimization of bad politicians. We think that's particularly important to recognize, right? Allow people to make bad decisions. We're happy for that in the long-term process of maturing democracy. But lastly, Madam Chair, with regards to the political environment and with regards to the discourse that happens, right? We think character assassination is only powerful when it's something that's new, right? If I know you've been sleeping around and I bring it up in the public view, that is powerful. If everyone already knows what you've done in the past, there is no value in me bringing it up, right? In fact, if I'm a politician who's done bad, I'll stand on the platform, right? I'll say, like, I've done this particular corrupt things, but I know that it's wrong. I'll tell you who else are involved in this if you elect me as a politician. They're more likely to run on the particular platform as opposed to running away from it. So it's not something that people, it's only a powerful tool to talk about, right? I think that everyone already knows about it. It's not a big deal, right? Argumentation. Before that, I'll take closing.
So, would you allow foreigners to run for elections?
No, because it's about people who represent your own country's interests and not someone other country's interests, right? Okay. I think you guys are going to be out of this debate. Firstly, creating powerful opposition to the tyranny of laws. Recognize that there's state initiative to change a lot of times, especially with regards to archaic laws, especially with regards to when judiciary and the executive are complicit, especially when you look at secrecy laws with regard to treason, right? The judiciary covers the executive's ass. And a lot of times, when individuals get convicted of these laws, they're excluded from the executive process, and they're excluded from the process of changing those particular laws, right? Think of with regards to sedition, with regards to the Patriot Act, the extent of the Patriot Act. Things with regard to secrecy laws, right? We think it's difficult to change because civil disobedience and rallying points for these kind of laws are limited because the individuals who suffer the most are the ones who are going to the prison process, are the ones who have to run away from the country, right? It's very difficult to change those laws. But when they can come back and stand up, when they're Edward Snowden to the world and come back and say that I'm standing up against this government on a legitimate political platform, they become an important symbol of the struggle in parliament. It's more powerful for them to galvanize support as opposed to someone who's not suffered the injustice, as opposed to a proxy who's not suffered a particular injustice. It creates legitimacy for a particular platform. It gives them a voice for them to share, and it gives a voice for the silent individuals who support these individuals who can't do it legitimately. Right? And this is incredibly important. But even if they don't get elected, Madam Chair, at the very least, there's airtime to those youth. There's a discussion about what these individuals represent. It's a discussion about the legitimacy of these laws, which is incredibly important to create, right? Now, moving to second argumentation. Why is it good for Parliament? Because number one, we create more diversity with regards to parliamentarians, right? We recognize that a large chunk of them are individuals who've benefited from white male privilege, the golden skirt phenomenon, right? We think that individuals, we think that also because of this particular policy, and because of cronyism, it has led to bad policies with regards to the criminal justice system, right? Creating blind spots like conflict of interest, like having more prisons because it's profitable, right? Having these individuals combat this particular policy, this is incredibly important for Parliament, right? Thirdly, what is important for restorative justice? Number one, it repairs harm. Allows individuals who committed crimes in the past come back and repair the harm they've made. Number two, it involves more stakeholders, right? It involves the entire nation that you've harmed against. And thirdly, it transfers the traditional relationship between community and government with regards to responding to crime. The discussion now is about not so much about how this individual is bad, but what contributing factors society and governments have with regards to the policies contributed to the cause of that crime. The discussion is important, Madam Chair, because we need to move towards more a community-oriented response to this crime as opposed to putting the blame on the individual and saying that he's the only person who is at fault for that particular policy, right? This is incredibly important to recognize. For all those reasons, Madam Chair, we're very proud to.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's invite the member of opposition.
Madam Chair, we don't think that individuals who have been convicted by a court of law to have committed heinous crimes to society, who have stripped society of its rights, should be allowed to represent these people and their rights in Parliament. We think this is extremely harmful and problematic to not just the society, not just the people, but also the country at large, and I'll extend on this in my extensions. But firstly, let's look at free rebuttal society opening government, right? Because the first thing they said people have the right to vote you in, even if you make mistakes. Firstly, we tell you that the mistakes that these people made are extremely heinous, and our stance coming from side closing up is that they don't deserve the chance anymore because they had their chance and they just blew it, right? By making these mistakes in the first place, there's no way that society, even if society can forgive these people and say, okay, you've made a mistake, we forgive you. We think that society should not forget that a mistake that they've done and act on that and allow them to vote in the first place. We don't think they should be allowed to do so because of that, right, Madam Chair? But also, we think that even if these people, we think by allowing these people to hold positions, we think that there's no way to ascertain that harm will not be caused in the first place to society, because we think that there's for more reasons that I'll explain in my extension, but mainly we tell you that
due to the possibility of harm, we think that the state has a responsibility to its people to restrict the number, to restrict the right, this right that they speak of, the right to vote in candidates. We think that this needs to be narrowed in order to prevent society itself and the people itself from making bad decisions that they potentially regret later. And I'll tell you how this happens later under my extensions. No, thank you, all of you. But also, secondly, they talked about how we prevent political discourse and we talk about harms of negative advertisement. We think we are fine with this, but this isn't bad discourse to begin with, because we think that everyone has the right to know, that the public has the right to know the background of these people. And we think that negative advertising, we don't see it the same way they do. We think that it facilitates the right of people to information and knowledge about the people they will vote for. And this means that because we tell you firstly that the average person may not have the incentive to and may not have access to the sort of information that the opposition parties will have the motivation to dig out on a political opposition candidate in order for their candidate to win. So we tell you that this is perfectly fine. This facilitates the freedom of information to the people. This helps them make a more educated, rational decision. And this is the kind of decision we want people to make in democracy to begin with. That is why we think that this is fine. We have no problem with that. Sit down. But then they came out and they said, the closing came up and said this idea of people who are not about how it prevents the fight against addiction, right? We think that this isn't necessarily true, because people who have not been convicted by the seditious laws to begin with can also fight the same cause. We tell you also, secondly, even then, the people themselves who have been convicted by the laws do not necessarily fight them themselves. People, third parties, or the political party, or people who share the same ideology can also fight for them. This does not in any way harm the fight against sedition. That's not relevant at all. But then also, a last point coming from government, right? Sit down. Then they said it's good for parliament diversity. We tell you this, even we are willing to sacrifice this parliament diversity that they speak of, because we don't think that it is right for them, for us to vote in people who have made so many mistakes and could potentially harm society so much more to take a place in society. No, thank you. And bring about the sort of diversity that they speak of, because the outcome would be better if they are not present. First extension, on the consequence of individuals convicted of any crime, no thank you, I'll take it after my first extension, convicted of any crime standing in parliament. We tell you, Madam Speaker, why do we jail, first of all, why do we jail criminals? Because we have previously been convicted of removing rights from society, and in order to punish them, we remove their rights in turn, right? So we tell you, firstly, what happens when they get out of prison? We tell you that this is where they're very likely to have vengeful intent. This means that they've been harmed by society before, they've been punished for their actions. Given that there's no way to ascertain whether or not they've really turned over a new leaf, we go with side opening up on this, we err on the side of caution. But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. Given the likelihood of harm that is present through the vengeful intent that has been already proven by a court of law and their own actions, we think that they may have an agenda, even if to run for parliament, to harm society even more. Even though their campaign may be persuasive, maybe manifested in certain ways, maybe the campaign may be attractive to people. We tell you, given their own example of George W. Bush, we think that it's extremely likely that people can run for parliament with hidden agendas and a totally misleading and misrepresentative campaign. Sit down. In order for you to be a good leader, Madam Chair, and for the greater good of the country to be good and stable, we don't think, no thank you, we think that in this case, we put all these things at risk by allowing people to run, even though they have been previously convicted. They may have even a vengeful agenda behind all this. But before that, opening.
If these people have made these unforgivable mistakes and they are so vengeful and they're going to go back to society and kill everyone, why do we let them go after they are rehabilitated to society, because they are going to be so vengeful and start killing people around?
No, we let them go because they've already paid the price for their mistake, but we don't let them run for parliament because they may not have the skills and may not have the mindset necessary to lead the people and represent the people. And that's something that they've not been able to recognize so far. No, thank you, all of you. I'm not taking any more. But also, this hampers their role as a politician, and they're unable to objectively carry out their job given that they have this vengeful intention. How is this so, Madam Chair? This can happen because in their role as a politician, we think that even though they may, we think that as a politician, you have to objectively view certain issues, and they lose this sense of objectivity after they've been convicted by society for the law. We think that this causes a great conflict of interest, the kind of conflict of interest they spoke of. No, thank you. So the people have a right to vote and choose wherever they want. We say the state should and needs to facilitate democracy by protecting individuals from these kind of individuals from coming to power. We tell you that society can be easily persuaded given the nature of campaigns, because they are persuasive in nature. That's how, using their own example, George W. Bush, that campaign was very persuasive. That persuade America to vote for him, and that is why, no thank you, the state needs to protect the people from making decisions that they potentially could regret later. We thought when Hitler came to power, also trade election, we think that caused great harm to Germany itself and the entire world. Given that people can be persuaded, we need to prevent this. But also secondly, how does this aid the fight against corruption and create a better political sphere? If you want to be a politician and you've aimed to do so your entire life, we think that these rules, the limitation of not being able to run for office if you be convicted, is likely to prevent individuals from participating in elements of corruption, nepotism, and other illegal things that could potentially jeopardize our political sphere. What this means is you essentially have a cleaner a political sphere where people are scared to make these kind of mistakes and to associate themselves with these kind of people. So we think that this means that overall politics will become cleaner, and given that nepotism, corruption, etc. are the kind of crimes that politicians and people who aspire to be politicians end up being convicted for, we think this decreases them, and these people, it results in a more clean political sphere. This increases the deterrence to corruption, and ultimately, because unfortunately, Madam Chair, we need to realize that in status quo, unfortunately, white-collar crimes are still traditionally, the sentences are traditionally lighter. So people, there's not sufficient deterrent for people to say, all right, I'll just embezzle $1 million and I'll pay a fine and maybe a few months in jail, and then I'll get out of it. I'll still keep my $1 million. We don't think that should happen. We think that there's not enough incentive currently to commit for all these acts, for all these crimes that politicians normally commit involving the people's money. And given the nature of these people, given the mistakes they've made and how we cannot trust them, we don't think they should be allowed to run for office. We're very proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Right, thank you very much. Like, to open the floor for your speeches. First up, those up there.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, society more often than not is a vengeful entity. When they have an individual that has breached the trust that society has put upon them to be an integral part of society, they have to pay a price. We send them to trials, we give them a punishment, but always balanced by the intention of the government to show how is it that post-conviction that they will be able to be reintegrated back into society. That is the argument that we keep in mind. That is the argument that what Albert was trying to push forward. So how do we temper that? We temper that with the rehabilitation process to show to you why is it that these criminals or convicted criminals for that matter, not only do they have the rationale to not make the wrong decisions in the future, to be aware of their mistakes, but also to realign that moral compass that opposition wanted so much to show you why it was never going to be aligned in the first place. So there are a few issues that we have to talk about first, coming from the member of opposition. When he talked about how there is going to be this vengeful response about how people, once they're convicted, they feel unfair. They feel that society has done them a wrong by sending them to prison, that they would come out, and once they become parliamentarians, to cause all these harms that he outlined. What he didn't realize is this: when a law is tyrannical, like what Albert has talked to you about, when you're convicted under things such as the Sedition Act, such as national harmony bills, or such as that of the Patriot Act if you're an American, right? What is more likely to happen is that you would come out and galvanize and find people who are in the same boat for you to push that law forward. But what is more important in trying to forward that cause? Is it more effective when you're simply on your fullest potential as post-convict under their paradigm, a lobbyist who doesn't have the necessary resources, or a parliamentarian who could necessarily garner the support of your comrades on a national platform for you to forward what are the changes that might be better in the long run, right? But this doesn't just extend to these perhaps special, circumstantial laws. It also moves forward into how that you could try to improve that rehab process or the support that the government gives to convicts, right? i.e. in the types of measures that you need to carry out in your checks and balances, for example, like parole on how parole can be improved, not just to check where they're going to be at, but the support that's necessarily going to be afforded towards them in order to ensure that that moral compass that they want to defend so much is not going to be out of place, right? So this is the things of which we're going to have to talk about. A few rebuttals before I go into the major clashes, right? It is important for us to understand that if this is a matter about caution, then caution has to be done on a very balanced point of view, not to the part of over persecuting these individuals. What have we acknowledged is this, right? Berat and Mustafa has talked to you about how the rationale of these people are very much intact. What Albert has talked to you further is to how is it that their moral compass are also intact for that matter. So if these are individuals who could recontribute back to the community like what they've talked about, why can't they utilize this platform as a way to submit to that community service, right, that Albert was talking to you about in restorative justice? It is important for us to show that not only are you an integral part of the community, you're also a part who could contribute back not just to those who are similar to you, but also to community in general, right? Why are we double burdening ourselves by, first of all, being afraid of them, and second of all, trying to restrict them in all these different endeavors that could have these spillover outcomes if they're done right? That is why Berat was questioning them, why the additional check and balances are not enough if they actually do work. So here's the ultimate contribution coming to you from closing, right? What do we acknowledge that is important? One, we have to talk about caution. Two, we have to talk about what exactly are better politics. And third of all, to talk to you more about the interaction that is created out of restorative justice, an effective version, Albert. But before that, one.
In Western liberal democracy, the judiciary always acts as a vehicle of social change by overturning malicious draconian laws. Why is this and other counter-narratives so insufficient that it may only derive benefit from ex-convicts?
What you need to realize is this. While it is true that the Supreme Court of many countries do have that right, it doesn't necessarily have afforded its resources. What do I mean by resources? Basically, on the part of the information, on the part of the experience, on what are the better outcomes that could be provided to the people, right? There's always a necessary balance that you have in order to create a better society in terms of the laws that you put onto its people. This balance of rights could only be feasible when you have an entity that could provide you the alternatives while having an entity to make sure that the alternatives are not flawed. That is the balance that we're seeking for, that is not unavailable under opposition. So what happens is this. We believe that caution is already enough coming for opening, but what is important is this. What about the restorative justice that we're talking about? What Albert has talked to you about is that, look, the harms have been repaired. Because basically there's an enhanced interaction, not just on the part of the convicts towards how they want to prove themselves against society, but also on how is it that the victims of these said harms, right, if there are victims in the very first place, as a result of tyrannical laws, are also brought up to the surface as to why it may not necessarily be the fault of the convicts themselves, but rather that this burden is shared by the community at large and the government as well, to show how is it that perhaps a segment of society, because of the background, for example, or how that we treat certain aspects of society, like how feminist movements are not pushed forward enough, for example, that as a result, that these crimes are created, that the nature, the culture of how we are we're more incentivized towards the criminal movement, right, is actually created. Knowing these backgrounds, who knows them better? Would it be a clean slate person of which we show on the politic platform, or is it a person who have gone through the process themselves, who's shown that rehab is possible, but how is it that we could then create a very important element of CJS, that is prevention of the crime in the future, right? That direction is something that they have to show. Because by increasing the number of stakeholders, would this paradigm actually happen, like what Albert has talked to you about? So these are the contributing factors that come out of it. So then we talk about, in the end, about what are better politics. Madam Chair, it is good for Parliament to always accept more people, regardless of the race, regardless of the background, but more importantly, whether they're criminals or not. In fact, we feel that you going through the CJS yourself would give you specialized knowledge as to where exactly are those weaknesses of which you want to talk about. Be it, is it because the trials are inefficient? Is that this allocative efficiency are the things of which we have to think about if we are to improve government and its whole. So this adds to another balance as to how governments can become efficient. These are the analysis that they refuse to engage with us. We feel very reluctant that we have to explain so much to that matter. Thank you.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, democracies are not absolute. Because based on historical evidence, we've learned that people don't necessarily make all the right decisions all the time. And therefore, governments have to step in to facilitate the best form of democracy, which is something we've been pushing from side closing government, and something that has not been engaged with necessarily by side closing. No, we push from closing opposition, didn't engage with closing government. So I have two questions in this debate. Number one, how best do we protect the rights of society? And secondly, does this benefit democracy and a little bit of the justice system from closing government, right? But first, how best do we protect the rights of society? Because the overwhelming narrative we hear from the government bench is that people have the right to vote. At the end of the day, people should be able to decide whether they like this person or not, because eventually people are not stupid and they make right decisions all the time. And then Barrett keeps asking this question, why did people vote in George Bush, right? Because the answer, Madam Chair, is in the question itself. They have the capacity to vote for him, and they made the mistake of voting for him at the end of the day. What we can do best to facilitate democracy, Madam Chair, is to give as many solutions as possible where we can measure where there is likely intent for the politicians to go wrong, where there is a likely intent for this person to be harmful to society and prevent this person from running from power. In other methods, yes, we couldn't have prevented George Bush because he probably didn't have a criminal record, probably he didn't do things that and we couldn't prevent some people, but at least we can prevent more people. I don't know what you're hearing for. No, thank you. More than that, Madam Chair, that's why I asked in the POI, right? Why do governments do this? That's why governments don't necessarily allow foreigners to run for power, because they realize is that there is an intent for foreigners to not because even if people can vote the foreigner out, we still don't let the foreigner run for power. It's because we realize that there is an intent for that foreigner to not act in the best interest of your country. That's when governments do all the time to facilitate democracy in the best interest of society, Madam Chair. That's why we think it's important for democracies to react in the best way possible, right? Because people don't always make the best decisions. Germans in 1930 voted for Hitler, and Hitler killed 6 million Jews. We don't think that all the times decisions are the best. That's why governments need to step in. But they told us in closing government, well, we can do this because this creates discourse on whether or not George Bush was a great leader later on. This discourse is useless, Madam Chair, because the crime that he has done has already been committed. You can't retake the crimes that he has done. We don't see the point of this discourse. But lastly, in terms of protecting the rights of society, we heard this large idea on representation, right? And side closing extended it a bit more by saying parliament should be more diverse, a bit of a rehash. But let's firstly go on this analysis of intent first, right? Let's talk about representing prisoners. Because if they're going to make a diverse number of people within parliament, what they're essentially trying to say is that we need to represent more prisoners. The reason why we don't think this is necessarily going to be effective is because given the persuasive power of you representing prisoners to be not strong, we don't think politicians who are convicts are going to want to put that in the manifesto in the first place, right? There's no incentive to do so. If you're going to run for power and say, I want to give lesser sentencing, or I want to give more comfort to prisoners within prison, that isn't a very effective tool in pushing forward for that, for you to get elected, and people will necessarily drop it from the manifesto anyways. So we don't necessarily see how representation will happen. They need to tell us what are these exact things that they will be representing that other people cannot represent necessarily, Madam Chair. But also on the analysis of intent, right? If we can certify that they have intent and vengeful intent like we extended, Madam Chair, it's important to err on the side of caution. Because vengeful intent is not just something that we are saying because prisoners have been put in behind bars by society. It's because we realize that if they feel that they are unfairly put behind bars, Madam Chair, then they would want to make up for the crimes or the crimes that have been committed against them. The same way how foreigners would work, Madam Chair. If they want their own country to succeed within the economic sphere, then they wouldn't want your country to succeed and therefore sabotage your country, right? But then OG asks, well, if we think that if they have vengeful intent, why do we let them go in the first place? Well, because they can't represent millions of people when we let go of them, Madam Chair. If you put them in power, they can represent millions of people and screw up millions of people's lives. But on the second issue, does this benefit democracy? Yes, opening.
Oh, tell me, not all bad politicians are essentially convicts. Democracy is about a balance of rationality and irrationality. You're opening up a floodgate of arbitrary exclusion. Should we then put every voter through an IQ test to see if they're stupid or smart enough, or every politician through an intent and allegiance test? That's exactly what you're doing.
We can't put an intent and allegiance test because we don't know what the questions would be, Madam Chair. If we sure, why not, right? But essentially, we don't do that right now because we can't do that, and we can't put an IQ test because we can't determine what is that the people really want and what is more important than other things. Better ones. I really don't understand the clap. No, thank you. Now, does this benefit democracy and the justice system? Because what side closing government wanted to tell you is that this is a fight against repressive laws. Now, in response, we will tell you that most likely countries that would probably pass this policy are countries that don't necessarily have suppressive laws in the first place. Because if they did have suppressive laws, Madam Chair, then they wouldn't pass a policy where you can talk about the suppressive laws anyways. But next thing, Madam Chair, we think that is that anyone can stand up against sedition. Like, if it's not just Anwar who can strongly support, go against sedition if it's a bad thing just because he's been put in jail for sedition, Madam Chair. It's anyone who can do that. There's no necessarily mutual exclusivity for him garnering support, because anyone can garner support given the fact they can use him as an example. In fact, if they were to use Anwar as a prime example, it would technically be biased and less effective, because he's probably biased because he was charged for sedition, and the persuasive value in which he's standing for is probably less effective than anyone else fighting against sedition in society. But on this idea of restorative justice, right? We don't think that this is the best form of restorative justice, because you can do a lot of other things to restore justice by doing any other job, by just not screwing up with the society, by just not committing crimes again. Those are all forms of restorative justice that you don't necessarily have to put them in power in the first place. But lastly, right, on this whole reintegration of prisoners in society, because this is probably better for the justice system to function in the first place. Because side opening government wanted to argue is that, well, it sends a message to society that these people are good people, these people can improve, they can become better people because we've voted them in power, right? Firstly, this is on the assumption that they win in the first place. Because any Tom, Dick and Harry can run for power, but if people don't vote for him, then he's not going to gain any influence. Yes, here. Secondly, also, if they accept a thief, Madam Chair, if you did vote in a thief, for example, into power, that doesn't necessarily mean they will accept a rapist, Madam Chair. Society doesn't work on this metric that all prisoners are the same, and therefore accept all prisoners just because one prisoner has been voted in, one convict has been voted into power, right? For all those reasons, we realize that governments need to facilitate democracy, and this is the best way to do so.
Alright, thanks. Shake hands, get outside.